So what I plan to do today is, I guess, back things up a little. I'm going to get back to basics. I spend a lot of my time looking at the Food and Drug Administration as a federal regulatory agency. I feel like a lot of the things I'm going to be saying up here are referencing what he said or what she said, or different aspects here, because there's a lot of different things that have come up that are particularly on point with regard to what is the role of the Food and Drug Administration in all of this. So I put together a presentation which does a couple of different things, and I'm happy to ad-lib on any of this in Q&A, or if you've got questions as they arise, just throw a hand up, because what I'm trying to do here fundamentally is lay out, well, what are we talking about with regard to how these products even get to the market. It is a lot of basics. It is a lot of how does the statute come into play, how does the FDA as a federal regulatory agency really impact a lot of these issues we're talking about with regard to access and innovation, and acronyms like REMS that Michael took a look at with regard to antitrust behavior. So I'm going to lay out a basic overview for you, some things that I thought would be particularly relevant to hit on as I'm thinking about the FDA role in this. Because as we're talking about patent law, we're obviously looking at a specific United States Patent and Trademark Office. We're looking at the interpretation by the courts of what the agency is doing and what the scope of the patents are. As Michael just ran through with us, there are a lot of antitrust concerns that implicate the Federal Trade Commission. And now we're looking at the federal regulatory agency that actually approves these products, that reviews these products and tells manufacturers when they can hit the market. So they're dealing with a lot of this information very early on. There are set procedures in which they need to make it available to competitors, in which they feed it through the approval process. And so there is a really big role, obviously, for the Food and Drug Administration here. So what I want to do is take this giant step back, I think, and think about the FDA as a federal regulatory agency as it ties to the implementing statute. And I guess I should say statutes here, because I really want to look at how we developed what seems like this bifurcation between biologics regulation and drug regulation in the United States. And it really is due to two statutory frameworks that were historically separate, that have been sort of morphed together in a way to streamline the process. But nonetheless, we have two sets of statutory bases and requirements and language that feed into this process. I want to then dovetail into the Biologics Competition and Innovation Act, passed along with the Affordable Care Act in 2010. We've referred to this acronym a couple of times today, the BPCIA. And what I want to do is just look at it at a very basic foundational level. What does it do? What does it add? Because there has been a lot of conversation, decades conversations, dealing with how do we get a generic-like process established for biologic products. A lot of those hurdles came with the statutory differences, and the BPCIA sets forth a different way to do this. And a lot of the confusion and controversy that seems to be arising is around how are these two pathways, regulatory pathways, different, and what does it mean with regard to the patent issues and the antitrust issues and things that are arising as we see as the market develops. I'm going to touch briefly on FDA implementation activity, because I think it's worthwhile to talk about. I'm going to frame this as it relates to the statute, because the language of the statute does something really interesting. And I'll focus on that for a bit in one of the slides. Is there's no direct mandate to the FDA to promulgate regulations at all. There's a lot of discretion given to the FDA to determine, largely on a case-by-case basis, what the requirements are going to look like in order to show that you have a biosimilar product as it relates to an innovator biologic. And that might not mean a lot to some of you in the room, but it means a lot to me as an FDA scholar, because there is nothing in that legislation that says thou shalt promulgate regulations through notice and comment rulemaking, which is a really big deal here. I'm also going to take a look at a chart with regard to FDA-approved biosimilar products. A number of us have already been saying, there's a few that have hit the market. Some of them are with regard to this innovator biologic or this one. And I just want to talk briefly about not necessarily what those products are, but really what the chart means for us in a couple of different ways. Because as we're talking about biosimilar development, and Michael and others have touched on this, the market looks different. And I want to focus on the players and even seeing that there are players that are on sort of both sides of the court as we're looking at biosimilar develop. They're both the biologic innovator in one context and also the biosimilar product on the other. And what kind of novel questions does that raise for us, especially in the context of court challenges? Because we've got one case that I want to look at specifically, just decided by the Supreme Court, that doesn't seem too miraculous or provocative, but it is. It really is saying something about what these companies can and need to do under the language of the statute, and I think it has some long-term implications. I'm then going to end with things that I've been thinking about with regard to what are the challenges that are facing FDA, and not necessarily from a regulatory perspective, like how do they get these products to the market or how do they get the information out to consumers, but what are complicating factors? Where are there places where the FDA may be able to have an increased role, though has taken a stance of inactivity? And that's one that I really want to talk about a bit with regard to the recent Supreme Court case. Some of this responds or relates directly to Michael's presentation with regard to how is industry, in this industry specifically, utilizing post-market requirements, and those specifically called risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, which are ways that the FDA requires that additional information be fed back into the product review cycle, or not necessarily review cycle, but the product's long-term, I guess, exploration of what adverse events are, or what new information needs to be included in the label. There's some interesting activity out there with regard to what these companies are doing. And he had mentioned the samples, and I also want to explore another area which implicates citizens' petitions, where industry is saying, look, biosimilar or biologic innovators are using REMS in a couple of different ways that block competition. I also want to focus, and this came up in the Q&A, Nicholson asked the question about state substitution laws. I want to look at the scope of those. And Michael pulled out this idea that the state substitution laws with regard to biologics they're not implicated until you have an interchangeable product, and we'll see that we don't have any interchangeable products yet. But thinking long term, and especially thinking about preemption law, federal preemption law, I think there are some things that we need to be contemplating as we're moving forward. And then the naming issue, I sort of took the last one and changed that up, but the non-proprietary naming and impact on market competition, I think this dovetails with Michael's focus on disparagement, because, and I want to look at the names that we've got for these biosimilar biologics, because there's a question there about whether consumers are going to recognize that those are biosimilar versions, whether we want them to be recognizing that, and what kind of information is being provided to those that are prescribing these types of drugs. Okay, so here's my big step backward. I'm going to focus on the Food and Drug Administration. Food and drug law scholars love to talk about the history of the statute and the agency and all the tremendous public health aspects that really brought it to its current moment. But I'm going to pause myself and sort of stick to the biologic realm here. The FDA is a classic command and control agency. It's a federal regulatory agency that has both rulemaking powers and adjudication powers in a sense. It can issue orders. It can also promulgate regulations which have a legally binding effect. There is a monstrous statute, and I will say monstrous. I mean, this is a monstrous statute. The Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is codified in Title 21 of the USC, directs the oversight of human and animal drugs, medical devices, biologics, cosmetics, dietary supplements, products that emit radiation, many types of consumer products that we're accustomed to, including tobacco products most recently. Now, we have a second statute that is implicated when we're talking about biologics, and that's the Public Health Service Act. That is now, in the current moment, codified in 42 USC, so a different title of the United States Code, but it derives from a 1902 statute called the Biologics Control Act, which was enacted 4 years before the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or the first version of that current statute. So we have a historical bifurcation here by statute of these two different regulated product areas, drugs in the chemically synthesized small molecule context versus biologics in those things that derive from a natural source that are more complex, as many people have talked about already today. I just want to mention that Congress frequently amends these statutes, right? Both the Public Health Service Act and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. Most recently, the 21st Century Cures Act has garnered a lot of attention with regard to what it may or may not do, with regard to the authority of the FDA to review new drug applications. The FDA, as part of all of this approval review, depending on what type of product you're looking at, has much discretion, and this discretion is built into the statute to determine what kind of information is necessary in order to show safety and efficacy, or safety, purity, and potency, the language of the statute. And we have a number of guidance documents, policy positions, things that the FDA has put out that are not the statute and they're not the regs, but they nonetheless guide and dictate what industry is doing. And I want to make that point very clear, because that's what's happening in the biosimilar realm. We've got a lot of guidance documents that are saying, this is what we think, although it's not legally binding. And I think that's an important thing to internalize. The last piece that I want to note is this obvious connection here with the Food and Drug Administration as the regulatory agency that's the gatekeeper to these products getting to the market, along with the Federal Trade Commission and the United States Patent and Trademark Office. So these three agencies are obviously very active in the drug and biologic realm for different reasons. But one point that I also want to make is, historically, the FDA and the USPTO, while they're doing things on parallel tracks in a sense, they're both feeding into biologic development in a sense of what are the patents and also new drug patents. There's very little communication, and there's none that's written into the statute necessarily that they have to be talking about this. And I want to draw one example with regard to the Orange Book and what we see in the context of biosimilar biologics, where we don't have a similar sort of mechanism. Okay, so this is one of my favorite slides to use. I can use this in any context because it's really talking about all of the FDA routes to market with regard to the highest risk products. And the reason I put this out here is because oftentimes I think when we're talking about biologics versus new drugs, people don't really understand that there's these different statutory mechanisms at play here. And I just want to highlight this. The medical devices you don't need to pay attention to. That is just in there to round things out. But the new drug provisions are contained in the statute that I had mentioned before, the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. We have your standard investigational new drug process ending in the new drug application. The requirements are safe and effective, standardized clinical trials. And then we have the generic drug approval process, right? The ANDA, Hatch-Waxman in 1984 set out this abbreviated way to get to market based on bioequivalence. In the biologic context, we have something kind of similar, but different enough that I think it's relatively interesting to talk about. We've got an IND and BLA route to market for new biologics based on similar measures, similar clinical trial models, mechanisms. And then we have, and I'm using the acronym here, abbreviated BLA, when I talk about the biosimilar route to market. But you've got two levels here that are set out by the statute, and I want to pull that apart a little bit. You've got biosimilarity. You've got those products that are deemed to be biosimilar to the biologic innovator product. And then you've got this sort of heightened interchangeable status, where the FDA will make the determination that that product is both biosimilar and is able to be substituted. So that substitution question is baked into the statute. So there's two different levels there. Now, Michael very briefly talked about the charts that the FDA and others are constantly updating with regard to how much we see with regard to generics on the market and cost savings. And I think there's a valid question about how much cost savings biosimilars have actually brought to the market. And again, this is a very early project. The first biosimilar wasn't approved until fairly recently. But in 2007, I just pulled this from the FDA's website. They're saying that they've approved the most generic drug applications ever. Total cost savings savings in 1 year to be 11.8 billion, with 8.8 billion in savings through December 2017. Are we going to see the same sort of cost savings? We don't know, but this is a model. Congress passed the BPCIA to try and get similar types of results for these types of products. This is just a chart showing top-selling drugs in 2018. 8 of them are biologics. I just want to make that point that these are the expensive products that are on the market. This is channeling Nicholson's description of the bicycle versus the fighter jet here. Just this difference between new drugs and biologics in the sense of what they are. So on the one hand, we have small molecule drugs, as Nicholson said, the aspirin that you know what it is, you can see it, it's easy to create, versus biologics in which you have all sorts of novel things that are happening because of their size and the way they interact, and specifically what they do on an individual basis in the human body. So that is really fundamentally what we're talking about here when we're looking at why has there historically been a difference in the way that the FDA has treated these two types of products. So now I want to get into biologics regulation generally. What is the FDA looking at when they're regulating these products? The first thing that I've thrown out there is the definition contained in the Public Health Service Act with regard to what exactly is a biological product. So you can see that this is basically defined both by its source, right? What is it? Where does it come from? And also, what is it intended to do? A new drug, on the other hand, is defined by its intended use to cure, mitigate, treat disease. But here we have an added requirement that this is something that's naturally derived. It's something that is a virus, therapeutic serum, toxin, etc. And as I had mentioned, these two statutes, while we have similarities, are different in the way that they set up requirements and mechanisms for FDA review and approval. Now, at the end of the day, it's safe to say that the Public Health Service Act and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with regard to these requirements really boil down to a lot of the same things. Good manufacturing practices. The FDA wants to know how you're making these things. They want to know that you're conforming to good manufacturing practices as they set out in the regulations. There are investigational new drug applications that are required for both types of products. There are post-market requirements that feed into this process. One of them, the REMS, the risk evaluation and mitigation studies, a few of us have touched on, and those are post-market requirements that the FDA now has teeth to back them up with regard to penalties if they are not followed. And then also the enforcement mechanism. So all the standardized enforcement mechanisms that the FDA has available for other products are obviously available in the realm of biologics. So what changed with the BPCIA? As I noted, this was part of the huge federal legislation, the Affordable Care Act. Although this part, even though it was fairly long and complicated in what it did, was a small portion of the Affordable Care Act. I here briefly have that it was actually 4 sections of the Affordable Care Act. And what it does, it amends the Public Health Service Act to do a number of different things with regard to requirements for biologic biosimilars, as well as creating this biosimilarity and interchangeability hierarchy, as well as the patent provisions. And that's one of the really fun parts about the Biologic Price Competition and Innovation Act that's leading to litigation that is asking questions about what did Congress mean when they said this? How is it different than the Hatch-Waxman Paragraph 4 certification process? And what role does the FDA have in interpreting that statute? And FDA has very historically taken a hands-off approach to anything that has to do with patents that are in its statute, and rightfully so. The FDA is not a patent agency, but there are questions about how the FDA could ease some of these manufacturer bickerings about what is required when. And I'll focus on some language that really fleshes that out. Okay, so what did the BPCIA do? It did a number of things. I mean, it's much more complicated than this, but these are the 5 bullet points that I think warrant attention for us when we're looking for the connection between the FTC, the USPTO, and the FDA in this context. So the BPCIA does this thing where it is giving a lot of discretion to the FDA in not so many words, but it's saying that the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services, through delegation to the Commissioner of the FDA, can issue guidance with regard to how biologic biosimilars and interchangeable biologics are to get to the market. It says some things that we can use as guidance, but it also basically says, FDA, go crazy. You figure out what it is that manufacturers need to do in order to show you that they are biosimilar or interchangeable, because you're the experts. And this is different than Hatch-Waxman because we see a lot more detail in those provisions with regard to what bioequivalence means. Right? There are provisions on what needs to be included in order to show what bioequivalence is. There's a definition of bioequivalence. The BPCIA also creates a resolution procedure for patent disputes. This is the, who said it, patent dance. Somebody referred to it as the patent dance as they were standing up here. The BPCIA contains provisions that are much different than Hatch-Waxman. They do not create the tiered certification type of procedure that Hatch-Waxman does, much of it bound to this publicly available Orange Book, which is telling us what patents there are that are out there, because as part of the NDA process, the new drug approval process, if you are submitting your application to the Food and Drug Administration, part of the requirements is that you disclose the patents that you have on this specific drug product. And you have an ongoing duty to update those. Now, whether that actually happens is, we can debate that, but there is an affirmative duty built into the statute to put forth what those patents are, to update them. And that ties to this question of bioequivalence. If you are a generic drug, you're going to look in this Orange Book, you're going to look at the patents, you're going to look at what is deemed to be the therapeutic equivalent. What do you need to base your bioequivalent studies on? It's a very public process. This process is much different, and some of the patent people can get into this because it's obviously not my area, but this is more of an informational back and forth that goes on between companies, right? The biosimilar innovator is going to be getting something. We don't know what it is because the case law is a little unclear on what it requires because there's been some resistance to provide this information. But they're going to get information that this biosimilar is intending to go on the market. They're supposed to be getting manufacturer information and information about the product. And then there's a back and forth and a decision on what patents are going to be litigated. And a lot of it is detailed out with 60 days and notice and duty of, good faith dealings built into the statute. But it's much different than we see with Hatch-Waxman. Exclusivity. And by exclusivity, I mean exclusivity at the hands of the Food and Drug Administration, not patent exclusivity. So there's two different types of exclusivity that drug products, biologic products can achieve. Here I'm talking about that which the FDA gives. Now, interchangeable products, by which we don't have any yet, are going to be given 12 years of exclusivity. Pioneer biologics will be given 12 years of exclusivity, and there's 1 year of data exclusivity for the first interchangeable product. And then there's pediatric study exclusivity as well. Now, I'm not going to read through all of this. I just want to point out that the BPCIA does provide some bounds for what needs to happen in order to show biosimilarity and interchangeability. Right? This says biosimilarity means that the biological product is highly similar. Notice it's not bioequivalent, so this isn't a generic product. It's not bioequivalent in the generic sense. It's highly similar. Now, it's up to the FDA to decide what highly similar means, and they're doing it on a case-by-case basis here largely. Notwithstanding minor differences in clinically inactive components, and there's no clinically meaningful differences between the biological product and the reference product in terms of safety, purity, and potency. It gives a few things that are requirements here. So for biosimilarity, you must have the same mechanism of action, the same route of administration, dosage, form, and strength, and the facility assures that it's safe, pure, and potent. So those are very basic things. Those are imported from essentially the generic drug realm. What are the things that you need to show about your product? But it doesn't give you any information about the clinical trial requirements, the measures that are being used in order to show these aspects. Now, interchangeability is defined as biosimilarity plus, right? It's biosimilarity, it's biosimilar, it's highly similar, plus the FDA is confident that you can substitute this product without any harm to an individual patient. Now, the statute lays out a very simple two-part provision here, that there is necessarily a showing that there's going to be the same clinical result. And here's the language that's specifically in the statute, the risks in terms of safety is not greater than the risk of using it without such alteration or switch. All right, so what has the FDA done since the BPCIA? And I won't go exhaustively through this, this is to prove to you they are doing things. The FDA is on the ground figuring out and has approved many biosimilar products, and we'll take a look at those in a second. But they've created an implementation committee within the agency. They've installed an acting associate director for biosimilars, who I think is now not acting, but associate director. There's a biosimilars review committee created within the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research to advise the Office of New Drugs. A lot of coordination, collaborative efforts going on. Of course, the FDA is looking at what others have done in the realm of biosimilar approvals in order to inform this. They're embracing a totality of the evidence approach, which I like to put out there, because it's really fun to talk about a totality of the evidence and a case-by-case approach here. But that's meaningful, because it really means they're doing this as it comes in front of them. And so they're being careful, and also some would say not transparent in what they're doing on looking at these products as they come to them. They've launched the Purple Book in September of 2014. Now again, this isn't the Orange Book in the Orange Book kind of context. What it is an informational, if there's a biosimilar that has been approved, it says it whether or not there's any patents that are attached to that. And they've issued many draft guidance documents. I think I'm a little bit behind, but here I've got at least 6 or 7 of them. One of them that I want to point out is the non-proprietary naming. The FDA has finally come to the conclusion of how they're going to name these types of products, and I want to look at that for just a second. So here is a brief overview of the types of products that we're looking at when we're looking at what the FDA has reviewed and approved. Now, you'll notice that I started this with the first product approved by the Food and Drug Administration in March of 2015. I ran out of space on the slide in December of 2017, and I'll just tell you there's 8 more that have been approved since then. But there's a couple of things that I want to look at as we're looking at this chart. Not necessarily what the products are, but who the players are. If you look at the Zarzio product, the Sandoz and Amgen, that spurred the ultimate Supreme Court decision, where we've got the Supreme Court interpreting language within the statute on what is required of these companies in order to give information to each other. Now, another aspect is to look at, Amgen is in the Innovator Product Company in March, and then in September of 2016, you can see that they're on the other side of the court here. So we've got an interesting story about the market here, in which we've got companies that are on both sides of this, I don't know if I said court or playing field. And so there's perspectives here. You don't have as entrenched positions, or you might, but then they might take a different position in another legal dispute, which we are seeing. How much time do I have? Am I going?
So we are going until noon. So
okay.
If you have 15 minutes, it may be wise to stop, not immediately.
I will take a few more minutes. Okay, so the Sandoz versus Amgen case, I wanted to point this out because I think it does ask a question about the Food and Drug Administration. So this is, remember? On our slide here, we've got the first biosimilar approved in the United States in March 2015. We've got a legal controversy that ensues. Ultimately, we have the Supreme Court saying something very interesting about the statute. The statute, and here's for the patent wonks in the room here, the statute says these 2 things about this back and forth process. Again, this isn't Hatch-Waxman-like, this is different. This is the BPCIA. It says, not later than 20 days after the secretary, which through the FDA commissioner, notifies the applicant that the application has been accepted, the applicant shall, right, that word shall provide to the reference product sponsor a copy of the application and such information that describes the process used to manufacture. And as we know, there's lots of patents on manufacturing practices. There's lots of trade secrets. And so the manufacturing information is huge here. I call that the provide copy to innovator clause. The second piece is the biosimilar applicant shall provide notice to the reference product sponsor not later than 180 days before the date of the first commercial marketing. I call this the notice of the first commercial marketing clause. Two questions were facing the court. Number one, do you have to supply that information to the innovator? And two, when does the 180 days start? And ultimately, what we've got here is somewhat of a victory, somewhat not. It's hard to understand really how this plays out, but what it does do is it says that there is no affirmative duty to supply all of that information to the innovator company. It also says the 180-day notice starts as soon as you want to notify that biologic innovator. So this has a lot of impact on the exclusivity that you have on the market. If the 180 days has to come after the FDA gives it the green light, that's different than 180 days from when you submit that application to the Food and Drug Administration. So this is an important case. The one aspect I want to point out with my FDA hat on is this language from Justice Breyer, who's concurring in the decision, and ultimately he's saying FDA could change this. They could interpret the statute. They could say when that 180 days has to happen. They could say what types of information have to be given to that innovator product based on safety and manufacturing concerns. So this is I guess, sort of a push to the FDA to think a little bit more about what their role in this process is. It'll remain to be seen what the FDA does with it. A couple other slides that I'll just briefly go through. This is directly on points that Michael was making about how risk evaluation and mitigation strategies have been used competitively to prevent access. And I will also mention that some REMS have been patented. And so companies are disallowing competitors from using the best ways to, I guess, utilize that product by saying that they have a patent. Biosimilar substitution laws, I'll end on this. I think there are long-term implications once we have interchangeable products, what the differences in the language in these state substitution laws mean, and it directly implicates the uncertainty about federal preemption of drug products and also biologic products with regard to state tort liability. So with that, I will end. Thank you for listening. Yes, Michael.
So, to what extent do you think there has not been significant adoption of biosimilars in the US based on three potential explanations? So one is just the cost of creating biosimilars, the marketing, the difference with the biologic. The second is the games that biologic manufacturers play to keep the biosimilars off the market. And the third is the FDA, and maybe the FDA being slow on things like interchangeability.
I think it's all of them. So I'm not going to pick a specific one that I like the best, but maybe I would. Maybe the second one. Maybe the games. Because I think with regard to the novelty of the market, right? We're talking about the first biosimilar was approved, 3 years ago? Am I doing the math right? 3 years ago. So we're still trying to see exactly who the players are and how they're lining up. And also, what are the tactics that are being used, much of the stuff that you have talked about to keep these products off the market. And I was meaning to go back and look at, of the biosimilar approved products, how many are actually on the market? And I don't know the answer to that. I know that not all of them. But I don't know why. And I think it's because of denial of access to samples in some cases is stifling them even getting approved. But also, even afterward, if you're talking about the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy aspects, you've got shared systems that can be utilized. But the FDA also has a role in creating essentially waivers to be able to use those shared systems as well, which I think is muddling things up. Many are complaining the FDA isn't doing enough there. So I think it's a combination of all of those things as it plays out. Yeah, Nicholson?
So this is kind of a weird question, but it comes up based on something that I think what you and Michael have mentioned, which is that the identity of the biosimilars manufacturers ended up being different than we expected. And I think than they expected. I think when the BPCIA was being developed, the assumption was, yeah, it's still going to be big innovator companies and then small kind of hangers on, like, and we'll see the same sort of industry dynamics before. And it turns out that hasn't happened at all. And instead,
Right.
we've got big innovator companies on both sides of these debates, sometimes flipping sides, just
Exactly.
about different drugs.
Mhm.
So this is a very speculative question. Do you think that the law would be written differently if the big innovator companies had realized that they were going to be on both sides of this process?
If they had a crystal ball 9 years ago, 10 years ago during these discussions.
Yeah.
You know, that would be an interesting project to go back and look and see exactly who was at the table and if there's any legislative history as to what was being offered and what were the concessions that were being made during this process. And I think that's a conversation that goes along with any statute that impacts the FDA. The 21st Century Cures Act is another one that I had brought up, that you had a lot of patient advocacy groups and even pharma at the table, but yet it's being touted as this, you know, strengthening the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in a way that seemingly the parties at the table don't really feed into that story. So I don't know. I mean, it might be worth going back and trying to ask these companies if it's everything that they ever wanted and more, or if it has turned out differently. And I'm sure others are doing work in that area, but I don't know. It's a great question.
I can have a comparative perspective, of course, being European, you know. So one of the most kind of debated issues was the strong, extremely strong, and that relates also to your question, because an extremely strong regulatory exclusivity periods that
Yes.
are awarded under the
Right.
BPCIA. And they are awarded, of course, only for large molecule drugs, and you have another exclusivity under the Hatch-Waxman Act, which is much more, which limits.
5 years, yes.
And you know, in Europe, we have a 10+2+1 system of regulatory exclusivities, and they are applying to both, you know, large and small molecule drugs, right? So, do you know anything about this discussion? Because I think Obama here tried to reduce the regulatory exclusivity period, which was part of the deal with the big pharma industry when the.
So I wish Yaniv was here because I would sort of kick it off to him and say, what is the history of this? But yeah, I do. I'm not a exclusivity scholar, but I do know, there was a lot of attention drawn to, is it 7 years? Is it 12 years? Is it 12 years data exclusivity or market exclusivity? Is it 8? Is it 4? Yeah, and so the way that it was written was confusing, and there was much on the table. Yeah, probably on purpose. And so I think, feeding into that, there was a lot of back and forth on what that language ought to say. I mean, I don't know what the practical outcome really is going to be, because many of these innovator biologics that are already out there were approved through a different process, and so they don't have this 12-year exclusivity that's afforded under the statute. So, I mean, I don't know the answer to that question. Is there even a product that's been approved as a biologic, a pioneer biologic, that's gotten this 12-year exclusivity? I mean, I don't know. Yeah, get on that. Yes.
I was just curious about you. We talked a bit about the naming issue and adding these suffixes, and something that I've heard a lot is, so, you mentioned that this could be confusing for consumers, but a lot of the times it's the pharmacist who, in their drop-down menu, when they're looking for filgrastim SNDZ is not going to be displayed by a search for the word filgrastim. And so something that I've heard and tend to be inclined to believe is that this is also and this is something that I suspect is likely to also reduce competition. It just simply, I don't know how to think about this, but there's sort of the well-intentioned pharmacist who also is maybe a little lazy or is not focused on, I should go out and search for the biosimilar. That this will be the suffix that we have in the U.S. will be a specific impediment to competition for that reason, because of this intermediary person who would have to take an extra step. Well,
I mean, I think so. That would only arise, I think, in a couple of different circumstances, because if you're looking at the substitute. Where am I? the state substitution laws, the pharmacist is only going to be confronted with the automatic substitution or substitution issue if there's an interchangeable that comes in front of him or her, I think. And so I think the people really struggling with it are going to be the physicians or the medical folks that are going to be doing the prescribing, because they still stand in a position in which they can prescribe the biosimilar. It's not going to be automatically substituted because it's not yet interchangeable. But I do think that knowledge question is one that falls in that realm.
I'll talk about it after lunch, but I think there's a bunch of European countries have these physician education campaigns, and that's not an FDA thing, but that's like a policy choice, right? Which is educating people who are making decisions about which products to use.
Yeah, and I think there's plenty of authority within the FDA to do that outreach, to create training materials, and even, I mean, that's one thing in which REMS could bear a role. In fact, requiring that there be informational training on what biosimilars even are and what should be the considerations and how do you get information on the different types of products. Letters to practitioners, those types of outreach are well within the gamut of what the FDA can do if they are actually concerned about this exact issue, which I think they are, and I think physicians are as well, because that ties in obviously to liability questions. All right, I think we're right at time.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, everyone join me in thanking Jordan.